Alright, so I talked about this last time. I made a video with a little syllabus walkthrough. So what I wanted to do in this video is get us on track with talking about our course assignments. Now, as you'll see here, if you scroll down the blog, and I want to encourage everybody to make sure that you are working on the blog, you'll see that I have here for where we are week 4. You'll see my class, my 101.39 and my 105. You are my 101.51. You'll see right here, and you'll see some due dates. Now, these don't apply to you because we're in the process of catching you up. So that does mean, though, that I'm going to go back and I will embed these, and we're going to take a look at these real quickly. I have some previous posts going back the last couple weeks about essay, and particularly essay 1. And so I want to go back and take a look at these. So I'm going to scroll down here, and like I said before, I do have a blog post here about navigating Moodle, the whole kit and caboodle. So please feel free to engage with that. But what I'm going to do, just to sort of before I climb down into that, if I go up here in the top to course assignments, I scroll over here to 1 personal superhero narratives. Now, some of you may or may not have guessed that this was coming, but we're going to have a different set of due dates for you guys. So please look for that. I will post those. Probably we'll talk more about it next week when we finally get to meet in person. But what I wanted you guys to do, and so these will be different for you guys, so don't worry about that right now. What I want to focus on right now is go down here and talk a little bit about how this essay is going to work. And we're going to see a template, and I got a little bit of a PowerPoint to walk through, and I'm going to show you where all that's at. But basically, what you're going to do for this assignment, since it's a narrative essay, okay, this is our starting point. And to sort of spice it up a little bit, I decided it would be a really good place to start a narrative essay by perhaps trying to imagine what it would be like to both be yourself in your everyday life with the added sort of, I don't want to call it difficulty, but the added stress or responsibility of being a superhero. And so that's the basic premise of this here. You'll see here, what would it like to take for you to take your normal everyday life with going to school, work, etc., while also trying to save your town, city, or the world. And this basically breaks into a little breakdown I'm going to do for this, and we'll talk more about this when we see each other on Monday, but I'm going to have you guys get started on it for me. Now, where I'd like you guys to be is you'll see that when we see the template here in a minute, you're going to note that I have some requirements. You'll see that there's a brief superhero bio of both you and your alter ego, and 7 posts, 1 each day you chronicle. Okay. Now this can be spaced out however you want, but ultimately these 7 posts will be roughly 2 to 3 paragraphs in length. So if you minimize that, that would be 14 paragraphs plus the bio. 15 paragraphs is kind of the minimal version of this. Now I'm going to scroll down here, and I want to hit this idea of how this plays out. So what you're going to be doing in a narrative is that, and you'll see here right here, we're going to get to these in just a second, there are some key elements for this. Is the basic breakdown is, of course, you have the bio. Now you may write this last, not first, so consider that. Your first blog post will act as kind of an introduction. Your second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth blog posts will tell us a story about your life, your normal and superhero in vivid detail. And then obviously your 7th post will act as a little bit of your conclusion. So introduction, body, conclusion. Now this is important because there are some key details. We're going to hit them here, and then we'll repeat this a little bit with the actual PowerPoint you'll see here in a second. So the first detail that we want to consider in a narrative is a well-told story. And the basic breakdown for a well-told story is that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay, that's, if you want to take it in its simplest forms, that's how it works. All right. So like I said here, beginning, middle, end. All right. The next thing is descriptive details. Now, descriptive details is the idea that you are trying to, and I think this last sentence here really highlights it for us, is the aim to create mental sensations of sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures of the world where your story is taking place. And the idea here is that when we are descriptive and we use vivid detail, we want to make our audience feel as if they can see the things we are describing for them. All right. And then the last part here is significance. Tell us the significance of the event to you and its impact on you. What is the point about knowing this? And we're going to come around to all these in details. What I want to focus on right now is just getting you guys started starting off, getting your essay off the ground, and then start thinking about vivid details. When we meet on Monday, we'll talk about wrapping things up, do some exercises together. Okay, so writing your posts. Okay, so it says here, we'll begin typing up our posts individually in double space MS Microsoft Word. Okay, I have a template for you, by the way, to make that real simple and easy. Okay, of course, all revisions will do that way. Most of this stuff is just we're talking about digital formatting. Now, you'll see here at the bottom, there are 3 documents. The first one is a PowerPoint. The second one is the template. Last one is a checklist. Checklist gets a little bit more important when we come closer to the idea of when we're going to be turning this in both in rough draft and final draft form. Let me go ahead and start with the template, because I feel like this would be a good place to start. So if you'll notice here, I have a bunch of stuff highlighted. This highlighted stuff just means you have to replace it with your own information. So, and I've actually already put this is already double spaced. It's in Microsoft format. So I try to make this a little easy on you guys. So you'll see here name, you put 51 for your class number, you put the date it's due. You'll see here's a place for you to put your bio, and then here are each one of your individual posts for which you could just start typing for each of them. And I'm going to encourage you to sort of take this and approach this that we'll talk about in just a second. But since I have these, you could write these all at once if you wanted to. But to sort of give you guys a feeling for this, what I'm going to encourage you to do is to focus in on this first one. You'll notice that for each one of the blog posts, there is an individual area for you to give a personal subtitle to it. I want you to keep these subheadings like this, please, and just type in your information here. And so this is already double spaced. So what I'm going to encourage you guys to do is to have a complete of this first blog post, and at least be thinking about how you want to proceed with the ones that follow it when we meet next Monday. So I'll minimize that for now. Let's come back here and let's talk about this PowerPoint. Okay. And let's just jump into this a little bit. And now some of this is going to overlap. Some of it has some new information. I tend to build a little bit of redundancy into a lot of this, mainly because I just feel like there's never enough, you can never emphasize directions too many times. I sometimes feel like it just for the part. So here, superhero narrative. And so this is a relation back to when it used to be something I taught as a literacy narrative. But it says here that narrative is a story, and we read and tell them for many different purposes. Parents read their children bedtime stories as an evening rituals. Preachers base their Sunday sermons on Bible stories to teach lessons about moral behavior. Grandparents tell how things used to be. Same story. School children, college applicants, writing students often called upon to compose literacy narratives. Now, I've modified this a little bit. So if this was a standard literacy narrative, you'd be telling me about an experience with you reading or writing. Now, like you'll see here, in the past, I've gone with the traditional. Instead, I'm going to do a little bit more of a superhero approach. And one of the key elements that you can play around with in a superhero narrative is the idea of not only your superpowers and your superhero identity, but the secret identity. And this is an important point that you can actually make a point of conflict in your own essay. And so I have here a little description that if you're not familiar with this, in American comic books, a character typically has dual identities. One identity being the superhero persona and the other being a secret identity. The secret identity is typically the superhero's civilian persona, and this can be reversed. For example, they say the secret identity is typically the superhero's civilian persona. Like, take Peter Parker as the secret identity, and he really is Spider-Man. But you could also look at it from the position of Superman, where Clark Kent is the superhero, is the costume. Superman is who he really is. There's a lot of ways you can approach this, but ultimately, there's this public persona, private persona. Okay, the secret identity is secret because superheroes must keep this identity hidden from their enemies and general public to protect themselves from legal ramifications, pressure, or public scrutiny, to protect their friends and loved ones. I mean, imagine if you destroyed half of a city block and they could call you up and just hand you a bill. I mean, it'd be awful. It'd be really hard to do your job. And then, of course, the ultimate real one is the idea of protecting your friends and family. So, like I said, this could be a point of contention in your story, but I'm going to leave it up to you to determine where you want to go with this. Now, of course, going back to this idea, of course, this is a narrative. A narrative is a spoken or written account of collected events and a well-told story. And then, of course, the idea of a story and superhero narrative, which is what you're writing, is a personal account by you of an experience in your life, balancing, imagining what life would be like trying to be a superhero while also still a regular young adult. So what you're going to get to do here is you're going to get to pick how you want to proceed with this. Do you want to tell a completely fictional story made up about somebody and having to balance their life between being someone similar to you in age and opportunities and responsibilities, and also being a superhero? Or do you want to incorporate elements of your own personal life, which I do encourage people to do, to make it a little bit more interesting? Now, of course, remember those key features we talked about: a well-told story, vivid details, and some indication of the narrative's significance. What I want to focus on right now is talk a little bit about the well-told story and the vivid details. And then what we're going to really do is I'm going to sort of set you on the road getting started, and when we meet in class next week, we're going to focus heavily on the vivid details. What I'm going to really want you guys to have laid down when we meet is I want you to have it started and then start sort of thinking about an outline. And I'll show you where to look for both of those. Now, of course, like we said, a well-told story. This is the idea that you set up some sort of situation that needs to be resolved, that needs a resolution. Okay, this is the idea of conflict. All right, you want to hook us, and we're going to talk about this because this goes into the introduction. In order to try and get us to read on. Whereas in normal academic essays, we tend to focus on ideas around things such as a thesis statement. With a narrative essay, we're really thinking about a way to hook our reader. And so we do want that beginning, middle, and end. And I'm going to set you on the road to getting things started this week. So like you say here, like I had laid out before, blog post 1, introduction of your story, blog post 2 through 6, routine life, middle of your story, and then conclusion of your narrative in the last post. All right, vivid details. Vivid details are another crucial element because they help bring a story to life. Now, we're going to talk about this very heavily when we meet on next Monday. You want to help provide us with a feeling that we are there with you in the story itself, okay? Aim to create mental sensations of sight, sound, smells, tastes, and texture of the world in which your story takes place. And so, as I've been talking about constantly here, next week in class, we will focus not only on the vivid details, but the significant elements going forward. And then, of course, this comes down to significance. And this is, what does this story mean? Why did you tell this story? I want you to sort of spell out for us what this entire story was, why you chose to tell it. And of course, you can make the entire point of using this entire writing experience as a metaphor for how, as a young adult, you have a rather busy life and it's complicated. It might as well because you're a superhero. It's that complicated. It's just me throwing out an example there. But we'll get into more detail about that next week. So getting started. I want to go ahead here. Let's talk about choosing a topic. Now, the kind of story you want to tell is kind of important, and you need to focus it because you don't have anything more than what's basically 14 to 21 paragraphs to tell it, if you go 2 to 3 paragraphs per post. So you'll want to look at your own life and then try to imagine if you had to balance your current life with what it might be like as a superhero as well. So there's a point of stress there. If your life is rather boring, well, imagine if you add a little bit of flair of being a superhero. I want you to have some fun and some control, creative control over this. So here are some ideas, though, in case nothing's bouncing your way. How you got your powers. Okay, you could tell us a story about how you got your powers. You could tell us a story that involves you interacting with a team of superheroes or a mentor. These are just some standard tropes. You could tell us about a particular adventure. You might even tell us about a difficult villain or nemesis you overcame. Okay? You could even tell us perhaps a story about how you were protecting your secret identity from your loved ones for a very specific purpose. Things like that. Okay? There's a lot of options here, and I'm going to let you have some freedom with that. Now, with it right to the example, I want to show you an example. I like this one. I use this one a lot. This comes from Alison Bechdel and her graphic novel Fun Home. Okay, this is not only the opening of the graphic novel, which is itself a memoir autobiography of Alison's life growing up and coming to terms with her own childhood and relationship with her father, but it is a fantastic depiction of a story where you are set up with a kind of hook. And so I wanted to share that with you. All right. So if you look here, top left-hand corner, it says, like many fathers, mine could occasionally be prevailed on for a spot of airplane. And there's her as a young girl, and there's her father. And then we move over to the top right. As he launched me, my full weight would fall on the pivot point between his feet and his stomach. And there's her making oof. Okay. And then at the bottom it says, it was a discomfort well worth the rare physical contact. Now that's a clue. she's cluing us in here in her introduction that her and her father were not touchy-feely close of any kind, okay? Rare physical contact, and certainly worth a moment of perfect balance when I soared above him. You go on here. So here's her father, and here's her above him. And now you see the term in the circus, acrobatics, where one person lies on the floor balancing another, are called Icarian games. Now that's another important clue. There's a literary reference here to the myth of Icarus. Okay. And I'll tell you a little bit more. So now here she is about to fall. Considering the fate of Icarus after he flouted his father's advice and flew so close to the sun his wings melted, perhaps some dark humor is intended. Now, if you don't know the story of Icarus, basically the idea was he and his father Daedalus are locked in a tower on an island, and they are prisoners, and one day his father decides they're going to escape, and so he eventually makes them wings using wax and feathers, and gives his son advice before they take off. He says, don't fly too low or you'll be sucked into the ocean. Don't fly so high or the wings will melt and you'll fall into the ocean. Either way, you'll drown. Well, he's so exuberant with freedom and a chance to fly that he flies too high to the sun, and his wings melt and he falls in the ocean and dies. And there's that whole, don't fly so close to the sun, it'll burn you, all kinds of little things to stick out this, okay? So in the original story, though, she sets up here this idea of dark humor. In the original story, it's the child who flouts the parents' advice and is the one who metaphorically or real-lifely dies. Now, look what she says here in this last statement. In our particular reenactment of this mythic relationship, it was not me, but my father who was to plummet from the sky. Now, that is designed to be her hook. She leaves you with a sense of mystery, okay? She takes this relationship and this mythic narrative and she flips it on its head in order to sort of get your attention and make you go, ooh, well, what happened? And that's the key. See, now you want to know what happens. Then you would read on, okay? So that covers that. Now, in addition to that, I do have a checklist. We're not going to worry about that because that's more when time comes for wrapping up. Let me go back to the main home page here. Now, you'll see the most recent posts here on the right-hand side. I'm going to go down quite a bit of ways past that, but I'm going to go back to last week. And as I go, we'll come back to that outlining one. But if I go back to the week before, I've got a descriptive detail assignment. We'll talk about that and practice that in class on Monday. And I have some instructions there. But let me go back all the way back before the instructions about Moodle. Okay, talking more about the hook. In addition to the hook I presented you, I presented some other hooks from other graphic novels that I'm a big fan of that you can look at here. Okay? And these tie into ways of sort of hooking your audience, but also these kind of formulae. And then you'll see that I have the Fun Home one here as well. These typically have a connection to the idea, and I'll include a link to this in the email I send out this week, specifically linking you back directly to this if you want to take a closer look at some of these examples, because not only do they have hooks of these, but they also sort of set up beginnings and endings. Now, that little beginnings and endings sets up one of the things I want you guys to look at, and I will again include a link to this as well. Inside, go back up. I don't think, maybe I didn't post that one. Okay. But we'll talk about beginnings and endings. But one of the things, let's go ahead and talk about that right now, actually. So if I go up here to the strategy chapters, I apologize for this. The very first one I have here, chapter 29, this is from an older textbook I used to use. This one specifically covers beginnings and endings, and I'm only going to talk about the beginnings ones with you guys right now because that's where it's important, because one of the things, like I said, I was asking you guys to do was to formulate your email, your beginnings to your essay this week. So it says here, the purpose of beginnings and endings, and one reason I like to talk about this is that people oftentimes find beginnings and endings they're different depending on the type of assignment you do, but also they can be quite difficult spots. So it says here, beginnings, it oftentimes depends on your purpose and audience. And so it talks about academic audience, with oftentimes they expect to find an introduction, a preview of the content or subject matter, and this oftentimes includes a thesis. So we get on to essay 2 and 3 and 4, we'll do something more like this. So if I look at this example here, Tom Brokaw called the folks of the mid-20th century the greatest generation. So why is this generation of my grandparents seen as this country's greatest? Perhaps the reason is not what they accomplished, but what they endured. Many of the survivors people today don't have the moral character to withstand a depression like that. This paper will explore the Great Depression through the eyes of ordinary Americans in the most impoverished region in the country, the American South, in order to detail how they endured and how the government assisted them in this difficult era. So, first of all, first sentence is where the term Greatest Generation comes from. They put Tom Brokaw, and he's referring to basically the people who lived through the Great Depression and fought in World War II. So he lays out where the term comes from. Then he asks a question, and then he sort of sets up some reasoning here, perhaps the reason, and he uses all of this to lead up to that thesis statement. Now, this will become a little bit more important for us later on, so we'll come back to it. What we want to focus in on is more what we're dealing with now, which is with non-academic audiences. We want to entice them to read on by connecting your text to their interests through shared experiences, anecdotes, or some kind of attention-getting device. And so they offer up the example here of November 19th is the 135th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. On that day in 1863, with the Civil War only half over and the worst yet to come, Abraham Lincoln delivered a speech now universally regarded as both the most important oration in U.S. history and the best explanation, government of the people, by the people, for the people, of why this nation exists. We would expect a history of an event so monumental as the Gettysburg Address to be well established. The truth is just the opposite. The only thing scholars agree on is that the speech is short, only 10 sentences, and it took Lincoln under 5 minutes to stand up, deliver it, and sit back down. Everything else, when Lincoln wrote it, where he wrote it, how quickly he wrote it, how he was invited, how the audience reacted, has been open to debate since the moment the words left his mouth. So they set up with this common event of the story, and so at the end here, they leave us with this puzzle about, okay, we really don't actually know as much about it as we thought we did. They leave us with a mystery designed to help us perhaps move forward and hopefully be explained in the actual essay itself. So after here, I've got some examples of ways to begin. They talk with the idea of explaining the larger context of your topic, state your thesis, forecast your organization, offer background information, define key terms or concepts, connect your subject to your reader's interest or values, start with something that will provoke your reader's interest, start with an anecdote, ask a question, jump right in. Now, I'm going to flash forward here a little bit to a few of these because some of these don't apply to us yet. But so we're not going to worry about explaining the larger context or state your thesis or forecast your organization. We might do something involving background information. This person here gives a very detailed one, and I invite you to take a look at this. I'll include a link of where to locate this as well. They're describing the Mall of America before they go into sort of a puff piece about it. I don't think really defining key terms. You might connect to your reader's interests. That might be one that work. Provoke your reader's interest. This one's a really good one. Let's use the F word here. People say it's inappropriate, offensive, that it puts people off, but it seems to me the best way to begin when it's simultaneously devalued and invaluable. Feminist, 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 feminist. Okay? Of course, it's not the F word you were thinking of when he did that. Also, there's the idea of starting with an anecdote. This is when you tell a short little story that leads into the larger story. This one here about Alfred Wright, the 19-year-old. It's a really good one. And then you might even just ask a question. Any of these might be something useful to you to get started if it's one of those things where you get stuck. And so I will include a link where to find that in the email as well. It's in a little section here called Strategy Chapters at the top, and then you want to find chapter 29, but I'll give you detailed directions to get back to that. Now, going back to the main page, I want to find two things. First of all, since I'm having you start with the hook, remember that posting that I directed you to earlier. Okay, I want you to come up with this. And then the other thing I'd like you to come up with is I'd like you to consider how you want to outline your narrative. Because in addition to creating your introduction, I want you to consider how you want your narrative to flow from that point on. And of course, we have a couple different ways. First of all, we can do it chronologically. You can start from the beginning, describe the setting of people, tell us about what happened, say how the story was resolved, say something about the significance. You'll see that's the first one here, the chronologically ordered. Now, there is a one called beginning in the middle. This is where you start in the middle of the action, giving enough information to let the readers know what's happening. You go back, you fill in the details, people, specific actions, you make clear how the situation was resolved, and you say something about the significance. Now, the other one that I find, other than chronologically, is really the flashback one, and that's what we call beginning at the end. It's where you start at the end of the story, and you flash back to tell how the story ends up, then introduce the subject. Those are the two ways I'd really recommend that you look at, okay? So, in addition to those two, look for my email, and I will very specifically in the email link you back to some of these things. So I'll link you back to the significance. We'll even talk about in class dealing with using dialogue. But the main thing I'd like you to get started on for me is to start thinking about what kind of superhero narrative you want to tell. So I will include a link back to our major assignment here. And I'd like you to start in the introduction. And I want you to start by thinking about how you want this story, this narrative to proceed. And then everything else from that point forward, we'll talk about in specific detail when we meet on Monday. So we'll have a lot to get over to start working on, but I would like to at least get it started before we get to that place. All right. If there are any questions or issues that come up, please feel